Good evening, everyone. Oh, that was really nice. Thank you. Well, I would like to welcome you all to our Weinstein Authors Series program for this evening with Russ Ford and Todd Peppers in their book, Crossing the River Styx, the Memoir of a Death Row Chaplain. My name is Scott Dodson. I'm the Executive Director of the Library of Virginia Foundation, and I have just a couple housekeeping announcements to make before we start tonight's program. First thing I would like to do is just acknowledge the fact that the Weinstein Authors Series is made possible because of a generous contribution from Carol and Marcus Weinstein. So I just want to continue to thank them for their support of the library in this series. So thank you both. And then just to remind everybody, if you would ever like to support the library's work, you can visit the table after this event or visit lva.virginia.gov/donate. So we appreciate your support as well. A lot of our programming, a lot of our conservation work, a lot of our education efforts are covered through support through the foundation. So we thank you in advance for considering that. There will be a book signing after this. If you guys were walking in, there's a table across the lobby where they'll be seated for signing. If you haven't already picked up a copy of tonight's book, you can in the Virginia shop, which will remain open afterwards. I always recommend buying early if you can, but they'll be there. They should be there after the event as well. And then finally, or not finally quite yet, I'd like to remind everybody that our next Weinstein Authors Series will take place on Thursday, November 2nd, with Suzanne Strike discussing her book, The Middle of Somewhere, An Artist Explores Nature in Virginia. And that'll be our final Weinstein lecture series for 2023. If you really like literature, we also have our Virginia Literary Awards celebration happening on October 14th this year. It's going to be a really nice event. It's our annual gala event. You can find out more information about that on the website as well, but it's always a really good time. I think that's all I have. Oh, no, one more thing. Catherine Fitzgerald Wyatt, who will be moderating tonight's discussion, I just want to make sure that she's acknowledged for doing this and for the work that she does with her team, our education and outreach team, which are really responsible for so much of the public programming and outreach efforts. If any of you have been to one of our LVA on the Go events, they do those as well. So there's a lot of really important education work that happens at the library, and Catherine and her team are really do a great job managing all of that. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. Before we begin, one more thing that her team reminded me that I always forget, as you're leaving tonight, we have some comment cards to fill out about how the program went. These are really important because we send those to IMLS, correct? And that's how they evaluate the state's, one of the ways they evaluate the state's LSTA funding, which I won't get into more acronyms. But it's important that we have those cards filled out because it's one of the ways they evaluate our work. Thank you again for coming tonight. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Carol Weinstein to introduce tonight's authors. So thank you so much.
For just a couple of minutes before I actually introduce our authors more formally, I'd like to tell you what I remember about the Virginia State Penitentiary on Belvedere in the Oregon Hill neighborhood. It's actually was called the Wall by people who lived in that neighborhood or around and knew about it, and that is because it was surrounded by a very high brick wall. On top of that was barbed wire, and then there was, on top of that, a tower where guards could watch the yard. What I had no idea about was that it was built in 1797. And the first prisoner was admitted in 1800. I'd looked that up, no idea. Any of you remember it before it was torn down 30 years? Oh, look at that. It was torn down 30 years ago, and Now there are other buildings occupying that space. I'll tell you what also amazed me is that Virginia did not abolish the death penalty until 2 years ago, when the Virginia State Senate, under Governor Ralph Northam, passed the bill, signed the bill. It was a vote. It was a close vote. It can go the other way. So we all need to be conscious of that. Another sort of sidebar I can't resist is that I've served on jury duty. Have anybody else served on jury duty here in Richmond? Still a lot. Well, I thought I might not be selected, but I was, and it was a murder case. That's a story for another time, but it's quite a story. All this personal information is just to shamefully admit that until I read Crossing the River Styx, I knew practically, virtually nothing about the death row, except as it was depicted in the movies and on television. After reading this amazing memoir, I can promise those of you who have not already read it, be sure to stop by the bookstore or pick it up however you can, because it is the most compelling and gruesome story that you don't want to read and you can't put down. Russ Ford is a retired chaplain of the state prison system who served for over a decade as chaplain of the condemned men on death row, and you'll meet him shortly. Todd Peppers, a graduate of W&L, UVA Law School, and a doctorate in political science from Emory, is the author of, and co-author and author of 7 books on capital punishment. Both men have quite a story to share with you tonight. And I think you'll bring them out and I will slip away.
All right. Well, I'm going to agree with Carol. I borrowed the book from the library here today, and just meaning to skim it before I got ready for the program tonight, and I could not put it down. And I'm sorry, but your tax dollars today paid for me reading this riveting book. But I want to give Russ and Todd a chance to kind of share. You know, the first question is really for both of you. Why did you write this book, and what do you hope that readers get out of the book?
In 1994, I realized I'd been working for 10 years on death row, and I felt a little bit of passion to memorialize those years. I went on to establish a ministry and worked with 12 more men in the next 3 years. So I spent 13 years in active ministry on death row as a chaplain and a spiritual guide. I wanted to memorialize it because I knew that no one, the outside world really didn't have an idea of what went on. That you may think you know, but you don't really know. And there was no way for you to know because there were no books on it, or there was no communication about it. So I felt a real need to do that. And I started in '94. I had a lot of notes. I wrote down a lot as I was working with the men. I did research. I spent times in the library here, on the old library, which had great assets as far as the old penitentiary plans and all of those things. So I knew the depth of the things that were on it, and also some of the writings about it, some of the things that went on. So I had that kind of doing it. I began writing probably in '96, and what happened to me was one of the things I had to make a living, so I was doing that as well. In 2001, I had a brain injury, and I'm post-concussive now, so I still deal with the effects of that brain injury. But I felt that I was going to never write a book about it after that, and went through a lot of years not thinking about it, kind of pushing it away. Todd Peppers was writing a wonderful book about Marie Deans, who was my colleague, and just a real important person in the death penalty movement. I mean, she's old school, and she really taught me a lot. I taught her some things, and we were very tight, very good friends. In working with Todd, I also gave him my manuscript that I had of about 178 pages of story. He used some of it in his book on Marie. And then what happened was he finished that project and got the book off. He gave me a call and he said, look, this is some really good material. Let's finish it. And the only thing I could say was, sure, we'll finish it. That was my great answer. And it took off from there. It took us about 6 years to get the book off the ground and get it to the publishers. And working through UVA Press was just a marvelous experience. They are so creative there. And they work with you. They let you do your thing, and they work with you. They're very thorough, and they expect a lot out of you in return. And you do get a golden touch there from them. So that was another thing that happened for us. It just fell into place. We finished the book. Todd begins inquiring about ways we can sell it to who, and that popped up almost immediately. And that's how the book came about. Did that answer your question for now? Yeah, okay.
You know, I'll give a shout out to UVA Press as well. The struggle we had was how to structure the book. Crossing the River Styx, I think the title came to us fairly quickly, but Russ always thought of himself in this project as a guide, as Virgil showing you, the reader, or Dante, the circles of hell. And the very first sort of complete manuscript, it wasn't organized chronologically. It was organized by what we thought were the different circles of hell, which represented the different crimes of the men. And bless her heart, our acquisitions editor at UVA Press, who couldn't be here tonight, she's out in Minnesota, Nadine Zimmerly, read it and said, this doesn't work. And she was right. And what we did instead, hey, Steve Northup, the celebrities in the audience tonight. So what we did instead is we rewrote it chronologically. And I really think it works chronologically because you feel the growing impact on Russ. And one of the last chapters is toward the end of your work on the row, where Russ did 4 executions in 3 weeks in December of 1996. I don't know how you're still with us today going through something like that. So once we started reorganizing it, it suddenly really it fell into place. Russ mentioned our late friend Marie Deans. Marie came up here from South Carolina. She had worked with the men of the row at South Carolina, came up here in 1983 and established the Virginia Coalitions on Jails and Prisons. For 10 years, she was probably the best friend the men on the row had. The work, broke her. When they got ready to take down the Virginia State Pen, Marie said of the death house, they should keep it up like they kept Dachau up. Because it's so easy to drive by Richmond now, and except for an historical marker, that terrible place is gone. There's no end to it. Dale Brumfield is sitting out here. He wrote a marvelous book on the Virginia State Pen. So we have part of an historical record, but I think what I wanted to do, is preserve these stories. 1, because they need to be told, because 2, for 30 years, Virginians supported the death penalty, but they let people like Russ do our dirty work. And we didn't pay attention and we didn't care. and also maybe a little bit of never again. There are people in the Virginia General Assembly who make noise about bringing back the death penalty. Virginia was the first colony to have the death penalty. The first execution on this new country's soil happened in Jamestown. We executed 1,400 men, women, and children. And I don't know how many of Virginians learned the lessons about our bloody embrace of, state-sanctioned death, or what Justice Harry Blackmun called the machinery of death. I also wanted to tell Russ a story. We don't have very many opportunities in life to meet our heroes. And most of the time when we do meet our heroes, we're bitterly disappointed. But Russ Ford is one of my heroes. And Russ's story, his sacrifice, his wife's in the front row, his daughter's in the front row, they're collateral damage from the death penalty. The death penalty is like throwing a rock in a river and the rings just keep coming out, and everyone who gets touched by it gets hurt. And I wanted to tell Russ this story because Russ never sought the spotlight. He never did this for fame, and certainly not for fortune. But your story deserves to be told, and that's why I got on board with the book.
Thank you both. And Todd, you just also want to talk about your son, Charles? I know he's not
Yes.
here tonight, and sort of his role in this process.
Yes, I have to give both of my children a shout out. My youngest son, Sam, is sitting in the front row. Sam, you drag your children into your hobbies. Sam has been going to Williams and Mary with me because I'm working on a biography of Chief Justice Warren Burger, and I'm making Sam go through the personal papers with me. Charles was home for a year and a half from the pandemic. He was at Roanoke College in Iowa. And the pandemic took a toll, and Russ and I were a little tired, and the idea of redoing the whole book structure was daunting. And Charles, with their youthful enthusiasm, Charles first met Sister Helen Prejean, author of Dead Man Walking, when Charles was 8. And at that point, it was all over for Charles. Once you meet Helen Prejean, she's so magnetic, you get pulled into this. Charles helped us with a lot of research, a lot of editing, and really helped us tell some of the men's stories, because for some of these men, their backstories are so important, or the victim stories. One thing we tried to do was we didn't want to whitewash the crimes, and we didn't want the victims to disappear. And Charles helped us find information so we could talk about the victims as well. Because these men did some terrible, terrible things. And so we jumped on Charles's shoulders and his youthful energy, and they drug 2 tired guys across the finish line.
That's great. So, Russ, maybe if you want to start, how is this book different from other books that have been written by death row chaplains? Or you said there really wasn't a lot even out there.
I don't think there were many books out there that got into the spiritual side like this book does. If you do read the book, you'll see the progression of the spirituality that we went through as care providers, as a chaplain, a spiritual guide. The work moved into more of a hospice type thing with death and dying. And, we were able to comfort the men, certainly, but we were also able to draw them out because of the years that we knew them. And they trusted us. They had faith in us. Having faith in us was very important. And by doing that, it helped build faith in themselves as we pointed to their own inner life, something that no one most often, they had never heard anybody even suggest that there was something spiritual about them. And so we were able to really get into it. When we first started, the first executions were terribly miserable for us. The men went in scared, some of them defiant. It was a mess. So we had like 6 executions where it was pretty terrifying, and we left feeling like, what good are we? Like what a good are we? Well, what happened was we then had a man come in, Alton Way, who had a come to Jesus time while at Mecklenburg Correctional Center. Now, I don't believe in cheap grace, and I'm very suspicious of anyone that wants to get saved and they're all, I did the crime, I didn't, I'm a new man in Christ. Let the old man do the time. Let me go. You know, so the jailhouse religion, I'm very skeptical of. But let me say this, Alton Wade was one of the nastiest human beings that I had ever known. And everybody that worked on this death squad and others were just not looking forward to having to deal with him. But when he comes to us and when we see him, he's completely changed. I mean, his demeanor has changed and all of these things. And it's because he found the love of God. Now, we had a real experience with him in the death house. We sung hymns. If anybody of you know Lloyd Snook became a Baptist up there in the death house. He's the mayor of Charlottesville, I think, now. He was a lawyer who gave his time when nobody else would to death row inmates, and he's one of my heroes. Lloyd sung along with us. Marie Dean sung along. We had a regular little revival going on with Alton. He had one song that he made up, and he put it to the tune of the Beverly Hillbillies. So it was really fun hearing it and things. He had another one that he had. What you gonna do when you're at the end of the road and there's no one there but you? And that's a pretty important statement for him and for all of us. So he went in and sat in the chair, and he was the first man that the chair did not consume. He was bigger than the chair. Now let me say this, Alton Wade did some terrible things in his life. And I could not explain them away, nor did I think that he didn't do them and he deserved punishment. But he was a changed man there that day. And when he died, he knew some things that we all need to know about our own inner life and our own personhood. So he died. He looked over at me and he said, "Russ, Chaplain Ford, I hated you because of the color of your skin." That's what he said. And then he said, "I love you." And that was the last thing Alton Wade said. You know, it meant a lot to me. And I can't explain why he received grace or why we together experienced grace with him. He was certainly, and we were certainly undeserving, but we experienced it. He was the first time in my tenure that we had something spiritual to even look at. But I knew that it wouldn't work for everyone. Everybody's different. So I was watching television one night, and I saw Joseph Campbell on public television. Some of you may be familiar with this. He got to me, and I realized that there was something in him that I needed to know. So I got all of his tapes I could get. I was directing the chaplaincy programs. I'd be listening to them as I was going over the mountains to different prisons and things for supervising the chaplains. And he really helped me see, and like his Hero of 1,000 Faces was the name of one of his most popular books. And he showed these stages that people go through in order to get to where they're spiritually alive, where they find the grail or whatever. And so I started sharing his stories and other mythologies with the men. Not preaching or anything, but just sharing them in conversations. And I also developed meditation techniques and some yoga, and the men got into those kind of things. We had one man, Ricky Boggs, and I'll talk about him a little bit here in a minute. He actually he spent more time in a handstand doing push-ups while he was waiting to be executed than he did on his own feet. I have carried on conversations with Ricky when he was upside down. He went into the chair and kind of floated. We talked about the Tibetan Book of the Dead. He was into some New Age philosophies. If there was a book that the men were reading, I read it in order to know what was going on in their hearts and in their heads, and kind of to be able to be with them. And that worked, and we've got results out of it. Ricky was at peace when he died. What happened that night, though, when we brought him out, when he was brought out to the electric chair, they hooked him all up. They put the beanie on top of his head, hooked the electrical charge to it. They put the clamp on his right leg that would ground the electricity so it would go through his body. They had the death mask on. He's strapped in across his chest, across his legs. His wrists are free to do this. And we waited. We just waited, and we waited. And the regional administrator came over to me, and he said, Russ, the governor's having problems with going through with the execution. Well, I thought it was either time to raise hell or, celebrate. Well, there was no celebration. We knew that Ricky was going to be executed. So I asked him, could I go over and be with Ricky while he's sitting all hooked up in the chair? So I go, he goes back, he gets permission from the director of corrections, and I was given permissions to go over to the chair. So I went over, and I put one hand behind Ricky's neck, I put my other hand on his hand down here, and I knew from what the handshake was that we were hooked up. And I talked to him in the ear. I told him that there'd been a delay, but he was still in play, and it was going down. And I said to him, Ricky, just go with the flow. When I said that, someone yelled my name, Russ, no, Ray, no. Ray Muncie, the warden. It was crowded in the death house. If you read the book, you'll see what this is about, but it was just overwhelming number of people in there. And Ray Muncie was in the back of the death house while I was up at the chair. Ray never saw me when he came out. He went to the key and he turned it on. I lifted my hand off of Ricky and the electricity went right through him. Now, I want you to know that that was enough to make a preacher cuss. I'm not proud of what I said, but it did help. It did help. I tell people with the language and things, sometimes these languages really, these things that we don't approve of do help people, they do. There are more stories.
This is why the book's different. The book is different from other books out there, first because of Russ, but also the way Virginia put chaplains in the prisons. We're one of the only states, if not the only state, that state funds are not allowed to hire chaplains as state employees. So you worked for an outside organization that was never well-funded or organized, but I do think, and tell me if I'm wrong, it did free you up a little bit, because when you have chaplains in prisons who are state employees, they become a cog in the machine. The other thing is, in states like Texas, which are still executing people left and right, the state employees, the chaplains, maybe meet the men 2 or 3 days before they're executed. Now, there's volunteers who may be coming in, but they're not very well supported. You had relationships with these men for years. So you weren't coming in at the end and being as you might say, a Bible notcher, right? And that's what I think makes the story unique, is the few books that are out there, it tends to be individuals who were state employees. Because they were state employees, their hands were tied. Now, the Department of Corrections did everything in their power, at least in the 80s, to interfere with people like Russ. I don't know how many of you remember Bishop Walter Sullivan. One time they prevented him from coming in because he had nitroglycerin tablets because he had heart problems in his front pocket. The Department of Corrections said he was trying to smuggle contraband into the men. Another time they took away his hosts. Host is it plural? Hosts. And they told him he could use Wonder Bread to give the men communion. They interfered with you as well. There's a wonderful picture of the book where Russ is losing his collective mind at a press conference after an execution where they were having a potluck dinner next door for everyone who was there to see someone get killed. And the laughter and jocularity was interfering with your ability to minister to a man during the last hour of his life. I mean, I don't even know how you eat before you watch an execution, but they had a spread on, right? So that's what makes this book different, is because of Russ and other men. Joe Vogt, Father Jim Griffin, Bishop Sullivan. They were able to come in, and because they weren't state employees, I think they had different types of relationships. There's people in the book who I wish we could talk more about. I don't know if anyone in the room ever met Marge Bailey. Marge was, I think, the first woman ordained in the Baptist Church in Virginia. In 1977, Marge, as a woman, was the head chaplain of the Virginia State Pen. And she had marched through those doors and go into the cell blocks by herself. Marge trained you up. Marge was there for the first executions after we started the death penalty going again. The notorious Briley brothers, when they were executed, Marge was there. You replaced Marge after she got cancer. But, you know, it's just not Russ Ford that these stories are remarkable about. It's Marge Bailey and Marie Deans, Odie Brown. Odie Brown, who was a minister here in Richmond, the first time he ever saw an execution, he got his money's worth. He saw 7 in a 24-hour period, because it was the, Martinsville 7? And then he's back in the death house 20 years later for the Briley brothers. I think that's what makes the book unique, is because of him and the relationship you were able to have with the men.
That's great, thank you. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the relevance and I would say reception of the book now in 2023, since Virginia has abolished the death penalty?
Well, I had a student ask me once, I teach at Roanoke College, well, Professor Peppers, your book's great, but they just abolished the death penalty. Do you feel stupid? Yeah. 19-year-olds don't pull punches. And I said no, because I think the message of the book is fairly universal when it comes to capital punishment. And while Virginia has abandoned it, Texas hasn't, Florida hasn't, Alabama hasn't, Missouri hasn't. Now, there's still, I think, 27 states, and all the states, you know, it's the pattern, it's in the Deep South, are still executing people with some regularity. But, you know, also, I think the stories, these are men who did horrible things. Many of these men had already been sentenced to death by the time they were 10. Mothers who used drugs when they were pregnant, they grew up in illiteracy, poverty, sexual abuse, physical abuse, mental abuse. When they were young teenagers, they were screaming out for help. But yet, we didn't give them the help because we didn't have the resources. And they end up in death row, and then the best solution we could come up with is to kill them. You know, if you take 2 people and you sentence one to death and the other person is charged with life without parole, by the time you get to the end of 2 stories, one execution, one death in prison, we've spent about $1 million more to execute people. You know, my God, take that money and invest in Head Start. Invest in other mental health programs. So those messages, because even though the death penalty is gone in Virginia, we're still locking up 16 and 17-year-olds for the rest of their lives. Even though the death penalty is gone, facilities like Red Onion State Prison are still putting people in solitary for months and months and months, and then we're all shocked when they go crazy. And so I think the stories both of the brutality but also the grace, the moments of grace that you saw where these men, Russ used to tell the men he wanted them to be alive when they're in the death chamber. You know, the phrase dead men walking means you want them broken and compliant, and that's not what you did. And I think those stories, too, of accepting responsibility and showing that these men were redeemable, right, I think are universal.
We had men who were walking to the chair say to us before they went in. One of them was Bert Klossa, who Steve Northett knew and represented in his trial. Bert had a profound spiritual experience. He committed probably the worst of all crimes that you will read in the book. I have a hard time reading. When we were researching the book, I had a hard time with the nature of his crime. And it involved a 12-year-old girl. My daughter was 10 at the time that he was executed. And a friend of hers had been abducted and murdered, raped and murdered in Chesterfield County. And I didn't want to work with Bert. It just went all over me, just his crime and what he had done. And I knew Bert, you know, but I just had a hard time with his case. I went to a religious retreat, and I realized while I was at it, was Crescio for you who maybe Episcopals know of. And at the Episcopal retreat, they had us walk into, we were all brought in, the candidates there, we were brought into a dark room, and we walked around while they sung a song and a guitar, and they went through the Stations of the Cross, and then they had these readings that they had, and it talked about Jesus is speaking to us, to me. He's speaking to me, and he's saying, my other self. You're my other self. And that really worked on me. That I went the next day. I had to go to sort of a Eucharist, but also the group that I was with, we sat at the rail, and we prayed, and each person prayed, and then they would pass the cross. When the cross got in the palm of my hand, I started weeping, and I wept so hard I scared them out of the room. And they sent over the grumpiest old preacher they had on the Episcopal staff to talk to me. He was a great guy. I poured out to him the sins of these men and how ashamed I felt that I was their friend, that I was working for them. I felt shame. I felt guilt for that. And he was very helpful with me. One of the things that he said was, he was very good. He said, Jesus had a cross to bear. And he said, we have to pick up our cross. Your assignment's tough. Your cross is heavy, and you carry it. He said other things that were really great too. So I had PTSD bad. That my wife can tell you what she went through with that. When we were backstage here, my daughter was one of my children, Jennifer and Kristen, my daughter and my granddaughter are here. Jennifer was talking about somebody asked, what do you remember about executions with your father? And she said, he was weeping. He was weeping. She said she never forgot my crying. And I know what she's talking about because when I cried after an execution, it was from the gut. I mean, it heals me to cry. I'd like to say that I do practice stoicism, but I also have to say I cry. I know how to cry, and a few tears is a good thing, About executions, one of the executions I dealt with was Wilbert Evans. Wilbert was the largest man to be executed. He weighed over 300 pounds. He's about my height, 6'2". He thought he was going to get out of the death chamber because he had acted real heroic during the Mecklenburg escapes. That was national. It was a national news. Thousands of law enforcement people were trying to get the 6 guys that got out. Well, during that time, they had taken hostages on death row. And Evans risked his life to save the hostages and to keep one woman from being raped when someone wanted to rape her. So he thought, and about 20 Department of Correction officials, some of the top officials, were lobbying for him to not be executed, for his case to be, given commuted. So he thought he was not going to get executed. Well, as the story goes, he didn't. And so I guess it was about 9:30 that he got his turn down from the courts, and he began to panic. He had smuggled half of a paper clip, nail clipper, probably up his rectum, into the death house. And he had gone over to the bathroom. I saw him doing it. He went over to the bathroom and he got the toilet and he pulled it out. And Wilbert was trying frantically to cut his arm, to cut the vessel in his arm. So we're standing there and he's doing this, and so it's a little bit of tension. So we pull back a little bit, and with the team of Bill Jones was there. He's a diaconate for the Episcopal Church. He was there, and so was another religious advisor, William Bell, and Marie was there. And they said, what are we going to do? And I said, well, let's just follow him and see where he takes us, So they said, well, what will they do to us when they find out we know this and aren't telling it? I said, the worst thing that can happen here is they won't let you come back. We laughed. Bill Jones looked at Wilbur and said, I don't want you to do that. And Wilbur said, you don't? He said, no, I don't. You've done too much. You've gotten your GED. You've helped people. you know, you've rebuilt your life on Roe. That's a hard thing to do, and you've done it. I looked at him and said, there's a part of you, Wilbert, was never born and will never die. He looked at me, then he closed his eyes, and he said some prayers to himself, whatever they were. And when he stopped praying, I don't want to be like a Pentecostal here or anything, but there was a sensation there of cool air being in that room all at once. And all this tension that he had on his body just relaxed and just melted away. And that's the reality that I witnessed. I don't know what it was, other than I have my own suspicion that it was the grace of God upon this man. The warden came in to read the notice of his death warrant, which they do before they walk him out of the holding cell. And Ray Muncie was a good warden, good man. He was a warden that I have a lot of respect for. He came in and stood there with it, and he was getting ready to read it. And Wilbert said, Mr. Muncie said, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but can I read that? So Muncie looks at me kind of crazy, you know, and he just gives it over to Wilbert. Wilbert read his own death warrant. Then when he got in line, and the death squad was usually presses around a man, and they were worried about Wilbert because he was so big, whether they could get him in there if he fought. They'd actually practice with the largest man in the prison on the squad that they could, fighting them to get to the chair, just rehearsing in case he did do it. Wilbert went, and they moved back as opposed to being around him, surprise warden. Then we went into the chamber, and he sits in the chair. They strap him all up, and he's not got the death mask on yet. And he says, Mr. Muncie, next time somebody comes this way, give them a little poetry to read. It's good for the soul. It was amazing, amazing. Then he looked over at me, he said, Chaplain Ford, I love you. Then they killed him. Well, I couldn't face the executions any longer. I'd go in, I was probably as close as from here to that first chair right there where Sam is in. I would just turn around when they did the execution. I couldn't see them anymore. So I'm doing this, and all at once I hear some screams are coming out of the witness box. A woman is screaming. And I look over at Mac, who's on the death squad, and he looks at me and he goes, just like that. And then I turned and I looked at Wilbert. Blood was pouring down from under the death mask onto his shirt, dripping down his legs, onto the floor with a pool of blood. So I'd say that was probably the most harrowing event that we had. And I've often thought about Wilbert because of the wonderfulness, the wonder of what happened to him and then his death. They blamed it on pig's feet, that he'd eaten pig's feet. Later on, I think it was 6 months later, Bishop Sullivan was the one that requested the investigation on this, and it became public. They had put the death mask on upside down, and it had pressed in. He sounded like a pressure cooker, you know, before you put the cap on, it's sizzing up. That's what he sounded like because of that going across, and then the blood pouring down. So that's one of the horror stories, I guess. That was the bloodiest execution that we had.
Anthony Kennedy, Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy, who's no bleeding heart, once said that we as a people have an obligation to go into prisons and see the impact of our policies. I think that after Mecklenburg, the death row escape in 1984, and we have some people, Steve, you've been in death row, I haven't, they have made it as difficult as possible for the public to get inside Virginia prisons. And everything is hidden, and you were stonewalled. I wrote a book, my first book on the death penalty was about a kid who was the second to last juvenile offender executed, 17 when he committed his crime, executed in January of 2000. He was 26, Douglas Christopher Thomas. When I wrote that book, Chris was dead, and the facility where he was held at, Mecklenburg, had been shut down. And I asked for his records, and the Virginia Department of Corrections denied me. So I filed a FOIA request, and they denied the FOIA request on the grounds of institutional security. And I wrote them back and said, he's dead and your building's gone. What possible risk does this records request pose to the Department of Corrections? And they never responded. You know, Dale, you've done a lot of research with the Department of Corrections. Dale found some stuff in this library recently which caused the Department of Corrections to have kittens because we hide this away and we prevent people from going into our prisons. And, you know, I think it's part of the book as well, is to talk about, you know, how they pushed back that this wasn't a botched execution. And again, death row may be gone, the death house may be gone, but Red Onion and Wallens Ridge and these other facilities are still there, and they're pretty dismal places.
Yeah, could you both speak to that a little bit more? You know, we talked about the relevance of this book since the abolishment of the death penalty, but have you seen changes within the prison system as a result?
I have, you talking about with the printing of the book? I have heard nothing from the Department of Corrections in any fashion. I'm sure it's not there. I would be interested, actually, you know, in getting a response to the book, you know, actually. You know.
There's a gentleman at the Augusta Correctional Center whose name is Joe Payne. In the early 1980s, Joe committed a gruesome, inexcusable crime where he shot and killed a middle-aged woman who was the owner of a convenience store, and he went to prison for it. While in prison, there was a murder of an inmate that many of us think that Joe Payne had nothing to do with. But he was charged and convicted of capital murder for the murder of that inmate. And yeah, I think you met him on the row. About a day before, no, not a day, you were with him, 3 hours before his execution, Governor Allen gives him a conditional pardon from death to life based on serious concerns of factual innocence. This is George Allen. But part of the condition was he could not appeal, and he lost his right to parole, because in the first murder conviction, it was life with parole. So if you believe that he was innocent of the capital murder charge, because of that false conviction, he lost his right to be released on parole, which would have happened 20 years ago. He's now at Augusta Correctional Center. He's going blind. He has double vision. He can't get help for it. And there's a documentary film crew in Europe that wants to do a story. And the Department of Corrections will not let them take video cameras and interview him into Augusta Correctional Center. And so I don't see any change in policy. The process I had to go through just to go visit him was 3 months of a background check, et cetera. I used to be a lawyer. I used to be able to show my card and get in, but I no longer have that magic card. So I have no expectations of any reform in Virginia. I think they still try to keep everyone out, everyone away, because you might raise hell. I mean, visits, what does the Department of Corrections and jails want to do now? They want them to be online. Isn't technology great? Sit in front of a webcam, and you can see your loved one on television, and there's no institutional security risks. So you never see anyone in person. You never have a hug. You never have a touch on the arm. That's inhumane.
Thank you both. Well, we've got a very large audience here, so if it's okay with you, I'd like to invite folks to line up at either microphone and ask questions of Russ and Todd.
This is the most terrifying part of the evening. Like teaching class, can you ask your students if you have questions? They won't make eye contact with you.
Hi, Stuart Goodwin, former law enforcement officer. Worked the street when the Briley boys were out there doing their thing. Looked Linwood right in the eyes. If that wasn't evil, I don't know what evil is. His first homicide was his backdoor neighbor because he just wanted to see what it was like, and he was 16 years old. the last planned that they had found out that the police were getting close to locking them up. So they decided to, one of them was going to lay down in the middle of Meadowbridge Road on top of a weapon. They were going to call him to Richmond and Henrico, and whichever unit got there first was going to be the executed unit. Luckily, it didn't happen. An arrest was made, and we know the rest of the story about the Brawley boys. A very good friend of mine, who was a Richmond City police officer, Cheryl Nietzsche, was working an off-duty assignment at the Marriott on Broad Street, and Woodfin in Petersburg executed his wife's best friend, and the best friend's husband or boyfriend. Went into Hanover County. Well, first he came into Richmond, walked up to Cheryl, handed her a note. She looked down and he shot her in the face. She survived. She's alive today. But every 4 years she has to go before the parole board and plead. He got life in prison, but every 4 years she has to go before the parole board and explain to them why he should not be released. And this also happened in the 80s. He then went into Hanover County, and Bubba Worsham was sitting at a traffic light, and he pulled up beside Bubba Worsham and shot him in the shoulder. There was no confrontation. I understand that executions are brutal. There are some innocent people. I told you earlier that I'm researching the execution of, he would be my distant cousin from 1909 for the murder of his sister's father-in-law. And I believe he was executed because he was feeble-minded, a victim of the system. But I guess my question to you is, your book, it seems to me, wants sympathy towards these people. And granted, there are some people who do change, but how can you justify not executing some people that really truly deserve to be executed, like the Brawley boys who shot a woman just to see what it felt like, kidnapped a nurse who was walking home on Chamberlain Avenue because she just happened to be there, executed a DJ in Southside because he went out to get a smoke in between sets, and then raped a woman and tied up her and her husband and set their house on fire just for grins. I don't understand. I know that God forgives you for your sins if you confess your sins.
Can we have a response, please, and stop talking about this?
So
I think we get the point. Maybe not.
maybe I'm not being rude to you, sir, so I would appreciate it if you not be rude to me.
I think you asked valuable, question, and I think you've more than adequately stated where you are. I appreciate that. I am against capital punishment. I firmly believe it is evil in itself. I see the results of what happened to me and others. I was coming out of the death house once, and I felt a surge of adrenaline go across my back and like a zigzag, and I was having post-traumatic stress. The person who eventually became the captain of the death squad asked me, said, "Russ, what happened?" And I told him that I get this around executions. and that it just started a little early. He said, I get them too. He said, I was at a pork roast a week ago, and it put me right back in the execution chamber with James Briley. And he said, I had it all over me. He said, everybody gets it. Nobody can confess it. Nobody can talk about it. So nobody owns it. The warden at, I think it was James's execution, but I couldn't swear to that. But I could tell the story because Marge Bailey shared this with me, and so did another person that was there when he said it, was that when he got home after the execution, he went to unlock the door and go in, and his wife caught him right at the door and told him that he had to do something with his suit because she didn't want all that smell around her, and she smelt his hair and all of that. And he went and had to burn his suit and before he could come back in the house. I say that because executions are not financially the way to go. I mean, it costs more to execute, of course, than it does to lifetime put somebody in prison. I didn't like the Briley brothers. And I could tell you worse stories about what they did once they were on row to other inmates.
Oh, I saw the evil
Well, I could add to it. But I saw the results of that with O.D. Brown, what he went through after the Briley executions, the brothers, and what it did to Marge Bailey. They never got over it. So there's a cost to executing people. Don't get me wrong. I'm not babysitting people in prison. I mean, please don't misunderstand me. And I'm not wanting to coddle them in any way. My job is to make them spiritually whole if I can. That's my job. And judging them is certainly something that I have to deal with. What they did, the evil. And I have a feeling that evil begets evil that begets evil. By doing this, we keep the ongoingness of evil. We're not going to stop it by duplicating what they did, becoming what they did. And revenge is not, it may be something that the justice system deals with, revenge, but it's not something that's good for the health of an individual.
And I appreciate you going in there and trying to get them to repent.
No, that's not my job. I'm not in there doing that
well,
either.
it's to get them to accept Christ as their Lord and Savior, because it says in the Bible that if they confess their sins and they accept Christ as their Lord and Savior, that God is going to forgive or forget. They'll still have to answer when they get to heaven, but it states in the Bible that He will forget their sins.
Can I just briefly jump in? First of all, I have a hard time reconciling Christ's Sermon on the Mount with the death penalty. But, Sister Helen Prejean says this a lot better than I do. And what she says is simple and profound. Why do we kill to show that killing is wrong? In states that have highly publicized executions, after those executions, murder rates go up in the state because of what they call the brutality effect, because people see the state killing and they think that means that they can kill. It doesn't deter. No studies show it deters. It's too damn expensive. And, Deuteronomy, Exodus, and Leviticus have 27 death penalty offenses, including having a dangerous farm animal, talking back to your parents, and having sex outside of marriage. But I think the New Testament has a different message. But, Russ he spent time with these men, and the message of the book is not to release the Briley brothers. It's not to put them in a cushy minimum security prison. I can't remember whether it was James or Linwood, but the execution went so badly, their bodies were mangled. You know what we do after an execution in the old days? You can't touch them for 10 minutes because they're too hot. Then you take them to the cool down room where you have to take either cement bags or mallets and break their joints so you can get them in the body bags. And then when Russ visited the men in the death house, the conferences he had were around the same green Formica table that those other men had laid on. Are we willing, so if you do support capital punishment, would you have been willing to be there with the Bradley brothers? Because this man did it 28 times and he bears the scars. So we as a people, if we support capital punishment, then by God, get in there and do the work that these men did, because, you know, it caused tremendous harm. We have a story in the book where, you know, politics may strange bedfellows. Our friend Marie Deans had to talk the head of the execution team out of quitting. And here's Marie, who's against the death penalty. The head of the execution team says, I can't do this anymore. I can't reconcile with my faith. And Marie says, you are a kind and gentle man. If I have to be here, you have to be here, because the guy who's going to replace you is a brute. So the people who are captured and touched by capital punishment, we don't honor or recognize as collateral damage. So,
Can I say one more thing?
Yep, and then we've got a question.
The idea about Jesus in the New Testament. I had the problem with the fact that there were people in the death chamber. This is just me now. I'm not saying or going after them, that profess to be Christians. And the fact is that I couldn't see Jesus approving of us putting electricity through somebody's body, boiling them and cooking them inside out. Nor did I see Jesus pushing drugs into somebody's system to override their heart and put them through. I couldn't understand how they justified being people of faith with the acts that they were participating in.
hello.
Hello. Good evening. Good evening, and thank you so much for sharing your commentary and your experiences. My question is, what or who or how were you encouraged to take on that plight?
I didn't hear the last part.
How were you encouraged to do what you did? Is that right?
Yeah.
Take on this work?
I'm just feeling so, I haven't read the book and I haven't read too much commentary on what it is about, but it was enough to make me interested to come and find out and to listen more about sharing your experience. So, yeah, so what, who, or how did you become encouraged to take on this?
Yeah. The short of it is, I worked with underprivileged youth during my college years, the inner city youth. After that, I worked as a chaplain at Hanover Learning Center with youth, again, 12 to 15 years of age. I got to know a lot of them. And then I went and did some, after I graduated from seminary, I went to MCV, did some training there for a year as a resident in the patient counseling department. I took a position at Southampton Correctional Center in Deerfield as the chaplain of those two institutions. When I was there, Marge Bailey contacted me from the state penitentiary and asked me to befriend one of the men on death row and to be his spiritual guide throughout his life, leftover life that he had, and then into the chamber. I have more respect for Marge Bailey than I did any other minister. And when she asked me, I could not turn her down. But I didn't know what I was getting into. And Morris Mason was the man. He was a paranoid schizophrenic with the IQ of someone in the 5 or 6, 7-year-old range. He did awful things. There's nothing that you can say about what he did that would be pleasant. And I don't want to go into it all right here, but if you read the book, you'll see that we didn't walk away from what he did. We went to the governor to try to get him to intervene. That fell on, deaf ears. Morris was ill. He had served time in prison. He got out. In a very short period of time, he went to his probation. He sought the probation officer out. And he said, I'm going to hurt somebody. Help me, get me off the street, put me in a halfway house. Probation officer said, come back in a week. Now he's in psychosis. Okay, he's not like you and me at that point. I'm assuming you've never been psychotic. All right, but he goes through this. He comes back in a week, and he says, put me away, I'm gonna hurt somebody. He said, come back in a week. Well, he didn't come back in a week. And he did some terrible things, and he got executed. It's my first execution. And the one that, when I'm asked what one do you remember the most, it's Morris Mason. It's printed in here, you know, I can't get away from it, you know. And far as the effect of it, I had a hard time preparing to be here tonight. In my prep time, I read the book. And that was just, it was a torturous kind of thing for me to go back and relive it all over again. Now, I'd say that the book has been a therapeutic process for me. It has been a healing process, you know. But I'm not accepting a lot of speaking engagements that have arose because of it. I'm doing some, but I'm trying to get them about a month apart, you know, if I can, you know, to get away from it. Because it does. Last night I couldn't rest because I had the adrenaline in my body, and I was back at it, you know. And so, you know, that's the way that is. I wound up there because I was going to rotate as a chaplain with Morris Mason and then be put on to another man maybe 6 years later, you know, that kind of thing. It would have been about 6 years before I'd come back up to do it again. So what we had was I was relating to the men rather well, and getting with them, their families, others, you know, that were involved in their cases. Marie Deans and I became good friends. We bonded. So the other chaplains were not connecting as well. So George Ricketts asked me to take it over and be the director, the chaplain to the condemned, Virginia's condemned, and be responsible for all of the men. And I accepted it. I've been asked if I would do it again, and I think it's a good question. If the call came and I felt that it was the call, I would do it. But my wife and my children would raise hell.
Can I just briefly add about Morris Mason? One of the last things that Russ and Marie asked Morris in the death house was, what do you want to have on in the casket? And Morris said, I'm a big boy, I can dress myself. He was so profoundly intellectually disabled, he had absolutely no understanding of his own death. A couple years later, there was a man named Earl Washington Jr. sitting in the death house. Again, mentally disabled. He was 8 days before his execution. He had no lawyer. And the Virginia Attorney General's office didn't seem like that was a problem. And what saved Earl Washington Jr. was another death row inmate named Joe Geritano, who filed, I think, an emergency stay with Judge Marriage, late federal judge, and it stopped the execution. These stories should horrify you. When I tell my students these stories, I start off by saying, we're not talking about the ancient Roman Empire, like long, long ago, oh God, we never did that. These are the 80s and 90s, where Michael Marnell Smith, talk about the Bible. Michael wanted to be executed holding his Bible. We had no problem running 2,200 volts through him till his blood boiled, but the Department of Correction wouldn't let him hold his Bible when he was executed because they were afraid it would catch on fire. Yeah. They weren't worried about him catching on fire, but they were worried about the Bible catching on fire. This brutality should make you want, for want of a better word, make you puke. And this was not a long ago, and what's to say that we won't go back? South Carolina has authorized firing squads because lethal injection won't work down there because of problems, right?
Thank you.
I think we've got one more question.
I don't know if that's you or me.
I'm opposed to the death penalty because I don't believe we should execute innocent people. And we know over the history of all the people killed that some have been innocent. So whenever I meet people who are in favor of the death penalty, I say, are you willing to execute some innocent people just to get revenge who deserve it on the guilty?
Yeah, 132 people since the start of the modern death penalty, which is 1977, 132 people have walked off death row. Not because of legal tricks, not because of smoke and mirrors by their lawyers, but because of factual exoneration. And when I tell my students that, they say, well, Professor Peppers, we don't have anything to worry about now, right? I mean, we have DNA. A lot of those are DNA. The problem is there's not DNA in most of these new cases. Earl Washington Jr., innocent. Joe Geritano, innocent. Joe was pardoned by the governor, had his sentence reduced to life in 1991. Joe walked at a Deerfield Correctional, or was it Powhatan? Deerfield Correctional Center in December of 2017, missing a leg. Deerfield? Okay, Deerfield. And we were there. Steve and I were there. My oldest son was there too. Joe Payne, I know there's some folks here, we can have a good debate about Joe Payne. I think he's innocent. But yeah, I mean, death is different. If you get it wrong, you can't resurrect them and apologize to them. Earl Washington Jr. got $1.9 million from the Department of Corrections. But it's hard to compensate someone when they are dead.
Thank you both so much. Let's give them a round of applause. And I thank you all for your, I think, honest and tough questions, right? This is not a simple thing to think about, but I appreciate everyone's collegiality. Thank you for coming to the Library of Virginia. Russ and Todd, in a few minutes, will be out in the lobby signing copies of their book. If you'd like to pick one up in the Virginia shop, you can, and we hope you have a good evening. Thank you.